Greetings everyone, this is Brian Jump. In this video I'm going to present my lecture called Mixing, which is part of my series for Introduction to Music Technology. The topic, of course, is mixing. In this presentation here, I'll briefly summarize the art and craft of mixing pop music. It's meant to serve as a guide only. You'll have to create many mixes for yourself before you begin to truly understand this difficult endeavor. I'm going to focus this discussion from the point of view of mixing pop rock bands, consisting of drums, bass, guitars, and vocals. Even if this isn't the kind of music you're used to mixing or producing, the information here should be useful. Okay, after watching this video, you should be able to define mixing, identify the adjustable components of a mix, describe the problems encountered while mixing, label the goals of mixing, identify strategies for achieving these goals, and outline a procedure for mixing music. On the first day of my music technology class, I often ask students what the difference is between mixing and mastering. I'll usually say something like, what's the difference between an album that's been remastered and one that's been remixed? Typically, I am greeted with silence. Hardly anyone, it seems, grasps this distinction, or if they do, they are incapable of articulating it. So the proximate cause of this lecture and presentation then is to clarify this difference and to outline a strategy for performing one of them, mixing. So here are those definitions. Mixing is the art and craft of balancing volume, positioning sounds, and applying effects to separate audio tracks to create a single compound track called a master. And mastering is the art and craft of applying effects and volume adjustments to the master track. The master track, which is the summation of all sounds within a project, is a two-track recording consisting of a left and a right channel. Master tracks are what get streamed on Spotify, sold on compact disc, or otherwise distributed for consumer consumption. A mix, on the other hand, has many tracks, usually somewhere between 8 and 24, and exists only within the producer's laptop. You cannot buy a mix, only a master. So the critical detail here is that mixing is the separate audio tracks, and mastering is a single compound track. So if you look at a typical DAW, here we have the mix, right? Many channels. Here's the kick drum, here's the snare drum, overheads, bass, rhythm guitar, lead guitar. And you can adjust the volume and the pan and apply effects. And mastering is this main track over here. It's the summation of everything within your project. Whenever you bounce or mix down or finalize your project, it becomes this two-track master. And that's what you stream on Spotify or sell on compact disc. So for a pop song, common components are kick drum, snare drum, overheads, bass guitar, rhythm guitar, lead guitar, keyboards, horns, synthesizer, auxiliary percussion. Now many other track types are possible, but these are the typical ones. When you're mixing, you have independent control over all of these sounds. And when you're mastering, you no longer have independent control over these sounds. They've been summed into one two-track recording. When you're still in the mixing stage, you can apply effects and otherwise adjust and manipulate the individual tracks. You can turn up the bass and not affect the drums and vice versa. Now you'll get an overzealous mastering engineer that insists that they can do this kind of adjustment with equalization, but they're massively overstating what is possible. While you're mixing, on the other hand, you have real control over the form and the content of your song. So it's important to do it right and be familiar with all the details. So what follows is a summary of these details. It covers the adjustable components of a mix, the main problems you'll encounter, the chief goals, and a general, very general procedure for mixing. Okay, let's begin by examining the adjustable components of a mix. So for all of those different sounds in your mix, you'll have to consider and adjust the following: volume, pan, dynamics, equalization, and effects. So that means that for your snare drum, your kick drum, your guitars, your keyboards, your vocals, and so on, you'll have to consider those 5 things. So just do the math there. That's a considerable amount of work that you'll have to perform to make sense out of your mix. Let's define each one of those things just in case you're unfamiliar. Volume is the most straightforward. It refers to amplitude or loudness. And obviously you'll need to adjust the volume of each track so that it coincides and works well with every other sound in the mix. Next up is pan or panning, which refers to spatial positioning between the speakers. Because musical performances are usually delivered from a stage with some members of the band on the left and some members of the band on the right and some in the center, your task with the pan knob is to recreate this reality. Dynamics refers to amplitudinal differences within a single track. Not between tracks like volume, but within a single track, what kind of amplitudinal differences exists. Consider a bass guitar part, say it gets too loud at one point or halfway through the song it's not quite loud enough. That's the internal dynamics of that bass part. So with dynamic processors like compressors and expanders, you can manipulate the dynamics of a single track and wrangle it into a nice tight pocket so that it behaves and is ready to be mixed with its neighbors. Equalization refers to the volume of specific frequencies. So an equalizer, or EQ, allows you to increase or decrease the volume at specific frequencies or swaths of frequencies, anywhere between 20 hertz and 20,000 hertz, the range of human hearing. So with an equalizer, you can turn 50 hertz up, or turn 2,000 hertz down, or remove all frequencies above 10,000 hertz, or filter out 250 hertz while leaving 350 hertz untouched. All of which will drastically alter the quality and character of your sound. And that's the main purpose, so that you can more perfectly realize the sound's timbre. So you want to manipulate the timbre of each track so that it better coincides with its neighbors. You'll find through experience that most of the sounds in your mix are far from perfect. Some have too much mid-range, some need a treble boost, some have deficient bass, some are noisy, some are boomy, some are sibilant, and some are just awful. In cases like these, an equalizer is your go-to tool. Effects refers to signal processors like delays and reverbs. Now technically dynamics and equalization, those are effects as well, but they are so ubiquitous they get their own category. Effects refers to everything else, and out of that everything else, it's delays and reverbs that are the most common. Problem in the studio is your microphones are so close to your source that your sounds lack ambience. Most of the time you consume music at a theater or a hall, and the sound reverberates, and it adds natural reverb. But if your microphones are very close to the source, they don't have this effect. So you need to add it artificially. In comes reverb and delay. Incidentally, a dry sound is how you describe microphone capture without ambience. So many of your sounds in your mix will be dry and will need to have ambience artificially added. Okay, as I previously mentioned, adjusting these 5 components, volume, pan, EQ, dynamics, and effects, on all sounds in your mix represents a considerable amount of work, especially if you've got a project with a significant number of tracks. As you can probably imagine, this means you'll be encountering many challenges when trying to construct a mix of commercial quality. So next up, we'll inspect some of the problems that frequently bedevil mix engineers. So sadly, there are far more ways to construct a bad mix than a good one. One reason is a phenomenon called accommodation. It occurs when, through continuous high amplitude listening, your brain begins to fill in missing sounds with self-generated ones, and to ignore existing sounds. You may begin to imagine the bass being more present than it is, or you may be oblivious to an out-of-time cymbal crash. Your epiphany about these matters usually happens when you listen to your track with a friend, and he or she says, "What's up with that cymbal, man?" At which point, the true state of your mix comes crashing into consciousness, and you become painfully aware of the problem of accommodation. It usually happens whenever you're hyper-focused on one aspect of your mix, instead of the totality of your mix. I'm always equal parts astonished and disturbed when this happens, because it does happen. So watch out for it. Another problem that occurs when mixing is hearing fatigue. Hearing fatigue describes your perception of sound being different at the end of a mix session than it was at the beginning. Hearing fatigue will cause you to experience an imperfect awareness of the sound you're listening to, and you will begin to make unreliable decisions about volume, pan, dynamics, equalization, and effects. For example, you might turn up a guitar track because it's not performing well in the mix. At least it's not performing well to you and your fatigued sense of hearing. Then the next day, when you listen back to your mix, you'll be startled by the deformed, too loud guitar track. What the hell was I thinking with that guitar, you might find yourself asking. Such is the reality of hearing fatigue. So the solutions to these problems, accommodation and hearing fatigue, is to 1. Take frequent breaks, 2. Listen in a quiet environment, 3. Avoid overexposure to mid-range sounds, and 4. Create many working mixes. Okay, let's take a look at each one. So you should take frequent breaks. Try not to go more than 30 minutes without stopping and taking in about 5 minutes of silence. Maybe go for a walk and listen to the song play over and over in your head, which is what it'll be doing. If you've been mixing for any considerable length of time, it's pretty remarkable how long the earworm stays with you. Sometimes it's days before I can lose the earworm of the song I've been mixing. Listening in a quiet environment is also key. It's hard to make sense of audio when you've got a furnace running, or noisy roommates, or some other din adding to your noise floor. So turn everything else in your house down, then attempt to mix. Okay, and overexposure to mid-range sounds. This is a special problem that massively contributes to accommodation and fatigue. Most musical sounds are polluted with mid-range, so they need to be attenuated in these octaves. So with your equalizer, try notching out some of these frequencies, right? Your guitar, your piano, your horns, your strings, your synths, just mid-range, mid-range, mid-range. They're all vying for the same part of the sound frequency spectrum. So get the EQ out, perform some subtractive equalization, and you'll be surprised at how airy and clear your mix becomes whenever you remove mid-range sounds. Okay, let's take a look at this creating a working mix. So, avoiding hearing fatigue and accommodation, that's really only part of the problem. The other part of the problem is that you have to create a mix that is configured to sound good on many loudspeaker sources. And this is done by creating a working mix. Not all loudspeaker sources were created equal. So take this working mix, which is basically a rough draft of your song, and listen to that mix in the car, on a set of headphones, on a smartphone, on your grandma's hi-fi, on a boombox through a PA system, and on a set of high-end studio monitors if you have access. It's a tricky assignment, but trial and error should yield results here. The key to completing this assignment is making compromises until your mix sounds reasonably good on most playback devices. That's what the pros do, so that's what you've got to do. The main problem, I have to say, is that, unhappily, most people are going to listen to your mix on a telephone. And yeah, there's just no bass. It's all mid-range. But that's the modern world. Okay, let's take a look at the goals of mixing. So creating a good sounding mix, first and foremost, entails maintaining the integrity and coherence of a performance. It entails establishing a sound hierarchy, and it entails placing sounds in a space, like a room or a hall, to sculpt perspective. Now, out of these three goals, it's the first one that's most important, the intelligibility of your mix. The listener should be able to discern every sound in the mix. If they just want to sit back and listen to the bass, they can do that. If they want to listen to the hi-hat part, it's right there. Your mix should never be an indistinguishable wall of sound. So even if your timbres are raucous and rowdy, the raucousness and rowdiness should be clear in the mix. If a listener just wants to listen to your kick drum part, then they can do that. So that usually means spending time with your equalizer and your compressors, and we'll come back to that. Okay, next up is situating a sound hierarchy. Most people are just listening to the lead vocals or the lead instruments or the words. It's because most people are non-musicians. So these supporting sounds and background sounds, they usually just conspire to form what is colloquially called the beat. So these supporting sounds and background sounds, they have to be not as loud as the lead sounds. These other sounds are meant to prop up and support your lead sounds. And then, since all sounds are captured in the studio with close miking techniques, for the most part, they lack ambience. So you need to use signal processors like reverbs and delays to put your band in a hall or theater where the sound bounces off the walls and returns to the listener's ear, creating ambience. One of the problems that fights against creating an intelligible mix is masking. Masking occurs when one sound covers up and renders inaudible some other sound in your mix. It's the prime suspect in preventing you from achieving your first goal. So proper use of an equalizer is your best strategy, and you should probably use subtractive equalization. Notice in this equalizer here, everything below 1K has been first attenuated and then turned off, the old filter. In any case, this is wise. If you start boosting all your sounds, like, oh, I want more of this, I want more of that, I just want more, then you're just going to peak your meter, and you're also going to create an arms race for the mid-range and all other aspects of the sound frequency spectrum, the result of which will be masking and an unintelligible mix that nobody listens to. Another word for the habit of turning up too many sounds with your equalizer is called cumulative equalization, which can result in distortion or excessive brightness or masking or all three. So the best way to get a smooth and polished sound is to use subtractive equalization, especially in a curved shape between 200 and 4K, right? If you start just cutting out these frequencies in many of your sounds, you'll be surprised at how clean and airy your mix becomes. And then you have lots of room to make your sounds coincide more perfectly with one another. Another plan for equalization, besides subtractive equalization, is complementary adjustments. So for example, a bass guitar and a bass drum, they exist roughly in the same part of the sound frequency spectrum. So cutting 50 hertz for one and boosting 100 hertz for the other and vice versa will help them both be plainly audible. And you might try something similar for the guitar and the piano. So in this example here, looks like the kick drum got a boost around 100, and then the bass has a cut at 100, thereby freeing some space at 100 and then occupying that space at 100. That's a complementary adjustment. That's a good way to get intelligibility and clarity. So I remember when I was first learning to produce music, I knew I had to use an equalizer, but I didn't know where to begin. So I found this handy chart in a Cubase guide, and what is included here is common sounds in a mix like voice, guitar, snare, toms, acoustic guitar. followed by adjectives that are typically used to describe sound for these instruments, and then followed by a frequency range. Okay, so let's look at the snare drum. Say, I wish my snare drum had some fatness. Well, find 60 to 80 and maybe perform a small boost there. Or maybe your snare drum's got too much high end or too much slap, right? Then maybe find 4K and do a cut, right? Say your acoustic guitar is too boomy, right? Then, maybe cut 120, right? Just grab a little notch and pull it down. Okay, so that's just a rough guide. Of course, experience is your best master here. The more experience you get mixing and EQing music, the more these become second nature to you. And the more it will be obvious that you need to lean into cuts rather than boosts, right? You want to clear the deck for your sounds. So almost every sound that you're mixing will need some sort of cut. Okay, so after achieving clarity with your equalizer, your next goal is to construct a sound hierarchy, which establishes which sounds play leading roles and which ones play supporting roles. For example, vocals, lead guitar, piano, strings typically carry a song's melody, so they should occupy the top tier of your hierarchy, right, the lead instruments. And then bass, drums, rhythm guitars, and piano, they typically undergird a song structure, so they should occupy the lower tiers of the hierarchy. So in practice, establishing a sound hierarchy entails lead sounds not only being louder than everything else, but also panned dead center in your mix. Your hierarchy also entails lowering the volume of sounds that play supporting roles like drums, rhythm guitar, bass, piano, synth pads, etc. And in some cases, panning these sounds left or right. The supporting instruments need to form an aural architecture that props up and highlights your lead instruments, such is the nature of a mix hierarchy. Word to the wise, don't mix with the members of the band present, as they will all cry about not being 100% upfront and audible in the mix. In most cases, sounds that play leading roles happen sequentially and without overlap. For example, when the vocal phrase is over, the lead guitar should enter the mix at the same level of loudness that was established by the vocals. That is, it should be balanced with the singing, but never overlap the singing. If the two sounds, vocals and lead guitar, are ever happening simultaneously, then one or the other needs to be turned down. So check out the picture here. Here's the guitar, here's the vocal. Obviously the vocal is the focal point. Notice that its amplitude is larger. The guitar is playing a supporting role. And then the vocal phrase comes to an end. And look, the lead guitar now occupies the same or similar amplitude range that was previously occupied by the vocal. So there's no hole in the mix, right? Here's the lead, focus, focus, focus. And now they handed the baton off to one another. Now the lead guitar is the lead focus instrument. What you can't do is just have your lead drop out and then have nothing come in and replace it. And then there's a hole in the mix, and most listeners will be confused by that. Okay, your third goal of mixing is to place your sounds in a space like a room or a hall, which entails manipulating the relationship of space and distance via reverb and panning. Reverb recreates the sound of a performance space by layering multiple overlapping echo repeats in such a way that simulates a space like a room. All right, so we have a large cathedral here. So the sound is going to reverberate off of all of these surfaces and ceilings, windows, and return to the listener many times, creating an all-encompassing tsunami of ambience. So you probably don't want to recreate too many cathedrals, but you get the point, right? A room or a theater or a stage creates nice music-enhancing ambience that we call reverb. Panning recreates the sound of a band on a stage by distributing its sounds left to right between the loudspeakers. So, for example, you may put reverb on your ensemble to simulate an imaginary performance hall, and you may use panning to configure your ensemble left to right on that hall stage. When panning vocals, bass, kick drum, and snare drum, just leave these sounds in the center. And then when panning guitars, keyboards, brass instruments, background vocals, you might want to place those sounds to the left or to the right to simulate a performance configuration. Rarely should you pan sounds hard left or hard right. Like with all things to do with mixing, subtlety is key. As for reverb, a general principle is less is more. Be sure to avoid using different reverbs on different tracks, like a room setting for one sound and a hall setting for another. Your band should probably be in one room with itself, obviously. So just use one reverb, or maybe two, and then route all your sounds to these reverbs. Just one plugin, one setup. You'll get more streamlined results that way. And also avoid using long decay times or huge room settings, because these configurations will saturate your mix with yawning chasms of definition-destroying reverberation. With reverb, as with panning, and everything to do with mixing, subtlety is key. You should barely hear the reverb. It should be present, but not overwhelming. So if you're having trouble getting good ambience with reverb, you might want to try delay instead. Delay is another option for creating space. Like reverb, it generates repeated instances of the original sound, but unlike reverb, the repeated sound consists of just a few highly specific occurrences. Right? You can think of it as echo, like in a canyon. You yell your name or bark some syllable, you'll hear it echo discreetly and individually. Whereas reverb is one tsunami of all-encompassing, multiple overlapped echo repeats that conspire to form one wall of ambience. Delay is more streamlined. So reverb occupies significantly more space in your mix than does delay. So if you're looking for a streamlined approach to ambience, delay might be your signal processor of choice. You can recreate perspective with delay by routing your signal to an effects track that's been treated with a short time delay. Right around 70 milliseconds, the echo repeats become audible, and you can discern that there's two sounds. So if you keep a super tight delay and then you spread these out left to right, you'll get sort of a washed out, diaphanous, your sounds coming equally from the left, right, and center type ambience that might be useful and might be good at simulating something like a room, like a tight room space or small theater. So there's no preference, one technique over the other, delays or reverbs. You might even want to use a little bit of each to try to simulate the scale and scope of a performance space. Okay, so now I'm going to go over a super streamlined procedure for mixing, which I'm sure if there's any experts listening, they'll all cry and say, no, you're wrong. But there are many procedures as there are mix engineers, and I'm going to do the most straightforward mix you can possibly imagine. There are many other ways to do this, but this is how I like to do it, and this is how I like to teach it first. Okay, so step one in your procedure is to organize. I like to put the drums first, and then the overheads, and then the bass, and then the rhythm guitar, lead guitars, lead instruments. That works for me, but some other arrangement might work for you. It doesn't matter really. If it makes good sense to you, then it's good. But it must make sense. Don't attempt to mix a chaotic project that's loaded with mountains of tracks labeled track 1, track 2, track 3, along with a bunch of empty tracks and other superfluous tracks. So I can't emphasize this point enough. You want to save yourself a headache, then clean your project thoroughly and label your tracks clearly. Be sure to make your bed in the morning too. Okay, next, after you organize your project, let's consider that kick drum. So turn all other sounds in your mix down, and maybe put your kick drum to around -12 or so. Your kick drum represents the heart and soul of your track anyways, right? It really drives the song. So what you want to do is apply signal processors to your kick drum until it's a nice, dull thud that rattles your sternum. Don't pan it to the left or to the right, keep it dead center. As for signal processors, you'll probably need to use a gate, a compressor, and an equalizer, in that order. applied as inserts. So as a general rule for effects, dynamics and EQ should be applied as inserts. Reverbs and delays should be applied as sends. And as for the kick drum's effects chain, you'll use a gate to isolate the sound, the compressor to stabilize the sound, and the equalizer to enhance the sound. Gate, compressor, EQ. So sit and fiddle with these sounds until your kick drum is an absolute monster. Okay, then perform a similar process with the snare drum, making it a tidy, sharp bark that competes with and complements your kick drum. It should ricochet off your skull as if fired from a howitzer. Really, it's got to be strong. Your kick and snare got to drive the song. So like your kick, it should be in the center of the mix, so no panning. And you should apply some compression and equalization to it. So unlike the kick, you probably shouldn't use a gate or an expander, because oftentimes drummers have sort of a nuanced and subtle stroke that they do on the snare, and the gate will cut these off. So if you need some isolation, then use an expander instead of a gate, which is essentially the same signal processor, but with less severe settings. If you've never EQ'd a snare before, you might want to try some presets. Every modern plugin comes equipped with pre-configured settings that are often useful for getting you started, especially if you've never used signal processors before. In addition to dynamics and equalization, you probably should also route your snare drum to an effects channel that's been treated with some reverb. So now we need to start creating some scale and scope, and the snare drum is one of the parts of the drum set that should be treated with reverb. Now, some mix engineers will bus every part of the drum set to the same reverb. I don't know, I kind of like to keep the kick drum super clean. So like with every other part of mixing, subtlety is key. You don't want a 1980s pop sound on your snare. Unless you do, in which case you should probably experiment with a gated snare. So go ahead and Google that, gated reverb. But just a little bit of subtle room reverb might be nice. Okay, so next we're going to mix in and process the overheads and tom-toms. I like to filter the overheads under 500 Hertz, meaning that there's no need for any low sounds to be coming in from these microphones that are meant to accentuate the cymbals. So go ahead and filter them out with an equalizer, and pan one left and pan the other right. The tom-toms should be silent when they're not being played, so they will need a gate. And maybe send your tom-toms to the same effects channel treated with reverb that you sent your snare to. And also, you should pan your tom-toms to where they are configured in location around the drum set, and be sure that you match that up carefully with the overheads, otherwise you'll destroy the stereo perspective of your drum set. Right, the hi-hat is on the left, the rack tom should also be on the left. Right, the ride cymbal is on the right, the floor tom should be to the right. It's up to you. I usually mix from the perspective of the drummer, but you can mix from the perspective of the audience, in which case the hi-hat will be to the right and the rack tom to the right, and the ride cymbal to the left and the floor tom to the left. That's personal taste. If you're a drummer, you might want to just do it from the perspective of the drummer. Okay, so then process the bass guitar with some compression and some equalization. Be sure to make your bass guitar and your kick drum hold hands with one another and skip merrily across a magical field. Right, these two sounds need to work together. It's imperative that they form a powerhouse rhythm that drives your song and encourages dancing. They are the beat, to use the parlance of our time. If one is masking the other, then employ some complementary equalization, or a special kind of compression called sidechain. Go ahead and Google that too. Essentially, it means the signal processor on one sound is being controlled by the amplitude of another sound. So you place a compressor on your bass guitar whose settings are controlled by the kick drum. That's a sidechain. It's essentially telling your bass guitar to be quiet whenever the kick drum is sounding. So every time the kick drum sound, it squashes the bass guitar down a little bit. That's a sidechain. It's really useful for establishing clarity, but it is a hyper-specific and a little detail-oriented way of applying compression. So if it's beyond the scope of what you're trying to get out of this, then just go ahead and try to balance the kick drum and the bass drum to the best of your ability using EQ, amplitude, and compression. Okay, next we should process the rhythm guitar or the piano or the synths or whatever instrument is providing your harmony. Harmony refers to the chords. And do this by filtering out some of the low frequencies, right? We don't need this competing with the bass and the kick drum. And apply some compression so it stays in a nice tight pocket and doesn't misbehave. Has a consistent amplitude. It really needs to complement your bass and drums. So together with the rhythm guitar, the bass guitar, and the drum kit, this forms a unified whole known as the rhythm section. You might want to try panning your rhythm guitar or your rhythm instruments slightly to the left or to the right. Right? Imagine a performance stage and maybe the rhythm guitar player is set up to the left. This will provide your mix some scope and perspective. Okay, next let's process and mix in our lead instruments. So they will need equalization and compression, but they'll surely need some reverb or delay for ambience. So use the same reverb that you set up for the snare. Remember, the fastest way to muddy up your mix is to use too many reverbs. You want your band in one room, after all. So you might as well economize your use of signal processors and just send it to the same reverb. It's also wise to pan it opposite of your rhythm instruments, right? This has the nice, clear 1970s hard rock rhythm section setup. One guitar player is to the left, one guitar player is to the right. Bass player and drums are right in the center. You get a nice, clear mix that way. I'm still a super huge fan of that sound. Might make me a dinosaur, but I don't care. That's what sounds good to me. I like to hear the instruments separated in my headphones. So, some EQ, some compression, reverb, and you should be in business. Next up, let's process and mix in the lead vocals. You will likely need to apply some equalization and compression to achieve a loud, puissant sound that's designed to cut through your mix with confidence and power. Remember, according to your sound hierarchy, all other sounds are intended to prop up and highlight this one sound. It's basically all anyone's listening to. So keep in mind that most listeners aren't musicians, so all they hear is the words. To them, everything else besides the vocals is this undefined sonic reality collectively known as the beat. So remember, it really doesn't matter that you spent 2 days mixing and EQing your drum overheads. No one cares. Just say that to yourself until you understand. Do a good job on your drum overheads, but really, if you're going to spend time anywhere, here it is, right? On your lead instruments. Maybe I'm an old school curmudgeon, but go ahead and just route it to the same reverb you've been using for everything else. Keep it dead center in the mix and make sure it's louder than everything else. Okay? And finally, go to that master track and slam everything up against a limiter. All right, you need to achieve commercial quality amplitude. Now, don't go crazy. Somewhere around minus 13 or so RMS is all you need. Right? Everyone's going to listen on their phone anyways and just slam it up against that last volume button on their phone, and that just crushes it up against the limiter anyways. So set the ceiling minus 0.3 or so, and then start pushing the input value into that ceiling and aim for somewhere around, I don't know, minus 14 might even be better. And then measure it with a level meter so you can get LUFS. But in my experience, the LUFS and RMS, they're like 1 or 2 dB away. So if you get yourself in the ballpark with RMS, you can be reasonably certain that your LUFS is going to be good. So make sure you avoid peaking. Furthermore, you should have performed everything else just described in this procedure without peaking any meters. If you see that a red peak, press stop and fix it. You can't mix with red clips. That just means your track is broken. It's garbage now. Just say that until you understand. No clips. I don't care that it's not loud enough. Turn your headphones up. All right, turn the limiter on. You get volume somewhere else. You don't get volume by crushing every track all the way up to 0. Generally speaking, apply EQ and compression as inserts and apply reverbs and delays as sends. Okay, that's my super fast once over. As you'll soon discovering, mixing is hard. It's a rigorous endeavor that takes years to master. And this presentation here represents but the simplest of overviews. And if you're an experienced mix engineer, I'm sure you disagree with everything. But that's how it goes. You learn your own way. And you get your results through trial and error, by hook or by crook. So it's likely that you'll create many dull and uninteresting mixes before you create any of commercial quality. Experience is your best guide here. Try recording a whole album, right? 10 songs. And if you do, you'll be a better mix engineer on song 10 than you were on song 1. And then record another album. So there's a few things to keep in mind when you're mixing a song. First and foremost, the music must be good. None of what I just presented matters if you have a terrible song. A good mix can't save a poor song, especially one that's poorly recorded. However, a bad mix can ruin a good song. So there's a warning flag that you should watch out for. Don't ruin your song with some overzealous, ridiculous mix with 1,000 reverbs. Okay, so if you're just beginning, you should probably keep your studio fees low until you've proven that you can devise great mixes of commercial quality. Everyone loves recordings that are free, so just start going to shows and offering your services. And keep in mind, every engineer on earth is going to make fun of your recording and remind everyone of how bad you are at mixing. Right? It's rough out there. So do your best. You might want to devise some sort of rubric, a way of objectively measuring your product. So I created one here. The dimensions and components include clarity, mechanics such as editing, effects, and panning, and more mechanics like EQ and amplitude. And then it's on a 4-point scale: excellent, competent, not yet competent, or poor. So let's read the excellent one. What do you want from the clarity of your mix? Your mix is clear and well crafted. The listener can effortlessly hear the primary melody. The rhythmic and harmonic components of your mix combine to form an intelligible hierarchy that is plainly and expertly announced. All right, what you don't want is your mix is enigmatic and totally indiscernible. The listener cannot focus on the primary melody to any degree. The rhythmic and harmonic components of the mix form no mix hierarchy whatsoever. Okay, so you can pause the video and check that out, or you can come up with your own rubric. This is my effort to attempt some objectivity from an inherently subjective art form. Okay, let's check out this quiz. This activity entails adjusting and applying effects to individual audio tracks. Is that mastering, mixing, dithering, or processing? If you're dealing with individual audio tracks, you are mixing. What are the adjustable components of a mix? Compression, limiting, expansion, gating, ratio, threshold, attack, release, hold, wavelength, amplitude, frequency, phase, velocity, or volume, pan, dynamics, equalization, and effects. A, B, and C are specific signal processor components, but a mix is volume, pan, dynamics, equalization, and effects. If you can think of a sixth thing that needs adjusted, please email me. What is your primary goal when creating a mix? A, ensuring that all sounds are intelligible. B, devising a sound that has commercial appeal. C, highlighting music skill. D, constructing a danceable beat. Bar none, the most important aspect is ensuring that all sounds are intelligible. Your mix should be plain, clear, and understandable. What aspect of mixing involves placing sounds left to right across the stereo spectrum? A, mixing. B, mastering. C, processing. Or D, panning. Left to right across the stereo spectrum is panning. Which effect do you employ to simulate the scale and scope of a performance space? A, equalization and compression. B. Reverb and delay, C. Expanders and gates, or D. Overdrive and chorus. Scale and scope of a performance bass is devised with reverb and delay. What method of equalization is marked by the attenuation of frequencies? A. Comprehensive, B. Subtractive, C. Additive, or D. Complementary. Attenuation of frequencies is subtractive equalization. Lean into subtractive equalization. Create some space. Your mix will thank you. What is happening when your brain fills in missing sounds with self-generated ones and ignores sounds that exist? A. Auditory hallucination, B. Tweeter frenzy, C. Combination, or D. Sound mirage. I wish it was sound mirage, but it's C. Combination. Right? You're filling in imaginary symbols and bass and other things that don't exist, or you're completely ignoring ones that are there. What is a rough draft of a mix called? A. Working mix, B. Speaker copy, C. Source study, or D. Mixdown. Well, you need to do a mixdown, but it's actually a working mix. Right? Create a working mix, listen to it on your grandma's hi-fi, your boombox, your telephone, your laptop, your car, stereo, etc. How do you avoid hearing fatigue and accommodation during long mix sessions? A. Take frequent breaks, B. Listen at or below 30 decibels, C. Increase the amplitude of mid-range sounds, or D. Turn off your drum tracks. Although D is not a bad idea, it's take frequent breaks. Try to listen no longer than 30 minutes before you stop and take in some silence. What aspect of your mix is being described when some sounds play leading roles and others play supporting roles? A. Dithering, B. Perspective, C. Sound hierarchy, or D. Intelligibility. That is your sound hierarchy. You must devise one. It's up to you how you devise that sound hierarchy, but you need to have a lead instrument or voice that's propped up and supported by all else in your mix. What is happening when one sound covers up and renders inaudible another sound of similar frequency? A. Masking, B. Covering, C. Compressing, or D. Phasing. That unhappy phenomenon is known as masking. What is the first step you should perform when mixing? A. Apply effects to your lead sounds, B. Configure your bass tone, C. Organize and label your tracks, or D. Compress your kick drum. The answer is organize and label your tracks. Step 1. Don't try to mix a chaos project. And last question. You should use different reverb settings for each sound in your mix. A. True, or B. False? Now, I'm interested to see the person that pushes back on this, but no. Put your band in one room. Your mix will thank you for it. Okay, so that is false. Use one reverb setting, please. Okay. I hope that you got something from that. Thanks for watching.
Like I'm always smiling. I've seen your case. Looks like you're always lying. You've seen my space. Looks like I'm always floating out over the sea. So stick around a little longer, and you will know what's real. So stick around a little longer, and mama, you will know. You will know. I've seen your pace. Looks like you're always rushing. You've seen my taste. Looks like I'm always blushing. I've seen your lace. Looks like it's always floating out over the sea. So stick around a little longer. Oh, and you will know what's real. So stick around a little longer. Oh, mama, you will know. You will know. Look at me now. Now look at me again. Look at me now. Now look at me again.